see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, I'm Edwin Rutch, and I'm the director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And this is our international online conference on how can we build a culture of empathy and compassion. And this is panel number 18, titled The Intersection of Conflict Resolution and Empathy. And I want to thank Lorraine Siegel who has kindly agreed to put together this panel and will be the moderator. So Lorraine, please take it away. It's all yours.
Thanks, Edwin. Thank you very much. Just wanted to say my name's Lorraine Siegel, and my business is Conflict Remedy. And Edwin and I connected because I write a blog, and I wrote some blog posts in which I talked about conflict resolution and empathy. And he contacted me and asked if he could interview me. And we had a wonderful time doing the interview. And then he asked me if I wanted to put a panel together of conflict resolution people to continue the conversation. Well, I was delighted because it gave me a great excuse to contact three wonderful people in this field who I respect deeply and have inspired me, and they all said yes. So what I want to do is briefly introduce them, and then I have some general questions to ask all of them, and I'll take turns, who I ask first, and let the others respond, and then some particular questions for these three amazing people from their own perspective. So the three people that I invited were Eileen Marker, Cine Noble, and Kenneth Cloak. Kenneth Cloak is the director of the Center of Dispute Resolution in Santa Monica. He is an internationally known mediator, arbitrator, coach, consultant, and trainer. He's the author of many books, including Mediating Dangerously, The Frontiers of Conflict Resolution, Resolving Conflict at Work, 10 Strategies for Everyone on the Job, Resolving Personal and Organizational Conflict, Story of Transformation and Forgiveness, and The Crossroads of Conflict, A Journey into the Heart of Conflict and Conflict Revolution, Mediating Evil, War, Injustice, and Terrorism. He's founder and past president of Mediators Beyond Borders. He's worked in over 20 countries. He is an absolute expert in this field and has been a teacher and inspiration to countless mediators, including me. Another illustrious panel member is Cine Noble. She's a lawyer, mediator, coach, trainer, and consultant based in Toronto, Canada. She's a pioneer development of conflict management coaching, and recently published an amazing book called Conflict Management Coaching, the Synergy Model, which is a thorough, heartfelt guide for people who want to do conflict coaching. She trains and coaches her model worldwide, and offers special interest groups in this area for the Association for Conflict Resolution and the International Coaching Federation. She speaks and writes extensively on coaching and mediation, and she's written other books, Family Mediation, A Guide for Lawyers, and Mediation Advocacy, Effective Client Representation in the Mediation Process. And she's co-author entitled Conflict Management in a book entitled Knowledge-Based Coaching. And in 1991, she was appointed a member of the Order of Canada for her groundbreaking work in the travel industry for people with disabilities. The Conflict Coaching Guild is an amazing, rich source for peers, and I have learned so much from her. I'm just delighted she's here. And last but certainly not least is Eileen Marker. Eileen is a leader in the movement to integrate healing and transformation in legal disputes and other conflict settings. She's a litigation attorney turned mediator turned forgiveness teacher and coach. Her mediation practice focuses on commercial disputes and divorce. Eileen has led numerous trainings on forgiveness and transforming conflict. She hosts an absolutely wonderful free monthly teleseminar for professionals called the Forgiveness Forum, where she interviews the most inspirational and amazing speakers in the field. And she also wrote a very beautiful workbook called the Forgiveness Workbook with a forgiveness mediation CD. And the website is thepathofforgiveness.com. So those are our three presenters. The general topic, as Edwin said, conflict resolution and empathy. So I'd like to ask each of you, what does it mean to you, and how does it fit with the work you do? And let's see, Ken, would you like to start this question?
Thank you. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the best way of thinking of empathy is to think of it as some deep internal understanding of what is happening with other people. It turns out that there is an ancient history of interest in this topic going back to Charles Darwin, who hypothesized that particularly among social animals, it would make some evolutionary sense for people to be able to learn from each other rather quickly, and not just to learn in a cultural sense, but to learn actually physically how to do something. And it turns out that in the modern world, we have discovered through neurophysiology and functional MRI that there are mechanisms within the brain, actually a complex set of mechanisms within the brain, that allow us to do this and to gain some deep understanding of, through resonance and reciprocity, what is happening with another individual, not in the sense that there is a one-to-one correspondence between what we experience and what they are experiencing, because that would assume that there's a higher level of accuracy to this than I think experience tells us that is actually there. For mediators, however, it is quite clear that there are a number of different entry points for us to be able to gain a deep understanding of what is taking place inside another person. And to, if I can phrase it this way, calibrate our empathy. That is, to fine-tune it, to discover and learn in the course of a conversation, even a very brief one, some of the things that may be taking place inside another person that that person may not actually be entirely aware of themselves. And this, of course, is what coaches do as well as mediators. We try to listen to people's stories and listen for the places where they're incomplete, listen for the gaps, listen for the hidden elements that have not been mentioned, but would be there if we had experienced ourselves. So I guess the central points for me about empathy are, first of all, that it is present as a capacity in every person. Second, that we can tune that capacity. We can increase it. We can develop our capacity for empathy through careful listening and, of course, so far as empathy is concerned, has to be not only external but internal as well. There's a final point, which is what's the point of empathy? And here's a place where I think we're missing something in general, and that is empathy can be thought of as connected directly to a second quality, which is often not mentioned. And in my view, this is honest. So once you have discovered something that you think may be happening inside another person, there arises another question, which is, do I have the courage to tell this person the truth, even if it's going to be painful, even if it's going to challenge my relationship with them, and potentially cost me that relationship. So Niels Bohr, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, invented an idea which is called complementarity. And he talked about great truths. And a great truth is one that is also a great truth. And things that go together, like matter, like particles and energy. And in my mind, empathy and honesty and mediation go together. So if you're only empathetic without being honest, you will seem wimpy. And if you're only honest without being empathetic, you'll appear brutal. But out of this creative combination of honesty and empathy comes the capacity of the mediator and the coach to, in the place, discover something that hasn't been mentioned or that hasn't been highlighted, and then to help a person track that, locate it inside themselves, and discover what is actually going on for them. To me, this is the transformational power of empathy. I hope that's what you had in mind.
Oh, that's wonderful, Ken. Thank you. So I'm just going to ask Eileen and Cine what you would like to add to what Ken said, or your take on what empathy is and how it relates in general.
Who do you want next?
Cine, you
Okay.
talked first. Go ahead.
I'm not sure that I have a lot to add to that very thorough explanation. I think sometimes empathy, though, the three parts of it, that being one is that we not only hear, but we receive what the other person is feeling, that we recognize, we acknowledge those feelings. And the third one is that we act compassionately. And so I think generally it's not just being an observer of empathy, it's being a participant, to be able to get more in touch with the person and do it, what Ken has described, in an authentic and honest way.
Thank you, Cine. How about you, Eileen?
Again, I really like the comments that Ken and Cine have made. What I guess I would add, in just another aspect of this, I think it's so powerful for all of us, this idea of experience of being seen. And I think that being seen and feeling that we've been heard by somebody else that really understands is a real lubricant in conflict and in mediation, because the forces of the conflict often are so difficult and painful for people that they've really closed down to a large extent, don't feel that they've received this from the other person. So I think it is, one of the main things that we bring to the table. And I see it as very simply seeing the other person in ourself and seeing ourself in the other person, that resonance that Ken was talking about. And I know neuroscientists are telling us that this is all happening through mirroring and mirror neurons. And so there's a lot of fascinating science now to explain how it happens. But it's just that rather than judging, we're relating and understanding. And as Cine said, with compassion. That to me is empathy.
Yes, thank you. Compassion and empathy are so related, as we've all been saying. Well, Eileen, I'm going to go on and ask you the next question. You wrote this beautiful forgiveness workbook, and I've heard you speak so eloquently about forgiveness and invite other experts to talk about forgiveness. And how would you describe the overlap and the differences between empathy and forgiveness? What do you see as the connection?
I see them as being very interrelated, but not the same. And what my experience is that often one will flow from the other. So to the extent that somebody is able to empathize with the other person, it does sometimes open a doorway for them to then forgive the other person. And conversely, if they are ready to forgive, it enables them, it's easier for them to empathize. But I don't equate them, because you can have empathy without forgiveness, such as an experience where I understand how you feel, but I'm still really resentful and for everything that I went through. So that's where I see the difference. Or I can forgive without having empathy, which is that I'm accepting what happened and I'm making peace with it within myself, but I really don't understand you. Even though what you did, I don't understand and I can't relate to it, but I'm making a choice within myself to accept. So, but I think that's possible and that they are different. But again, more often they're interconnected, and I certainly incorporate. There are a couple of places in the forgiveness process where I invoke, or there's an invitation for people to have empathy. One of them is asking people to consider what was their positive intention in the situation. What was the other person's positive intention? And that often opens up empathy. Another technique sometimes that's used is asking the person to tell the story from their own point of view and then the other person's point of view, or sometimes write that. And in doing that, that can often be a doorway to empathy. And then the other area, of course, is also having empathy and compassion towards oneself, which is always part of forgiveness. So what I see as empathy really is that interconnection with how we're relating to the other person and reaching a level of understanding and compassion that is such a beautiful thing that you're really, I know, is the center point of this inquiry. And I see forgiveness is adding to that, the piece of coming to peace with what happened, really the story that you tell about it, and just having that inner resolution that really enables somebody to have peace and gratitude.
Yes. So the ideal is to have both, but they are separate yet interconnected processes.
Yes, that's how I see it.
Yes. Yes. Well, Cine, how about you? Do you have a response or something to add from your perspective on that question about forgiveness and empathy?
No, I think actually Eileen was very eloquent in saying many things that I would say, so I'm not going to add to that.
That's fine. How about you, Ken? Would you like to add something?
Yeah. One of the interesting pieces of neurophysiological research has to do with the relationship between empathy and storytelling. And it turns out that there are certain people who, as you begin to tell a story, or as, for example, I begin a sentence, some people will be able to immediately begin to anticipate where the sentence is going to end. You may have experienced that, as I mentioned this sentence just now. And people with high degrees of empathy actually complete the storyteller's story before the storyteller does. In their own mind, they find the end of the story. And that's the part that I think is really interesting. There are lots of different theories of empathy. There are somatic theories that basically look at how the body moves. But the one that I find the most interesting, actually, is from a man whose name is Khaleesi, who basically says that empathy is a shared manifold of intersubjectivity, meaning that it's actually complex. There are multiple places within the brain that empathy gets organized, and these kind of come together. Thinking about what Eileen was saying, in my view, there is a little breaking of empathy that happens in every conflict. Meaning, if we were actually able to deeply feel the experience of another person, it would be much more difficult for us to engage in conflict. And therefore, the creation of some kind of empathetic connection is a kind of completion of the conflict and a kind of reversal of it. So in my experience in terms of doing forgiveness work, one element in that is to try to help people understand what the other person might have felt, what they might have experienced. And in doing that, what happens is that they begin to create the other person's story inside themselves. And you can kind of watch this happen. We have little things as mediators and as coaches that we almost intuitively do without really thinking about them. Like, how would it feel to you if you were on the other side of this? What do you think what your position would be if you were the one who had to divide the house? Whatever the question might happen to be, that what's happening beneath the surface is that empathetic connections are being created, and they're being established not just physically, but through the story. There's a final little piece of this that also comes out of neurophysiology, and it has to do with teams of young kids who are playing sports in a competitive environment. And they have done experiments with this type of setting. And what they discover is that they can very, very quickly get those kids to a point where they hate the other side. But if researchers, for example, place a large obstacle in the middle of the field that the kids are supposed to be using to play on, and the only way of moving that obstacle is for the two teams to cooperate together to move the thing off the field. After they've moved it off the field, their attitudes are fundamentally different towards each other. So when we, for example, ask people to do something together, to jointly research some factual dispute, to go somewhere together, to look at something together, to brainstorm options together. Basically, what we are doing is we're giving them a common social experience that begins then to recreate the empathy. So I think there's a huge amount in this. And one of the pieces that I loved about what Eileen was saying is it is possible to do this separately. It's possible to have an experience of empathy and not really reach a place of forgiveness, and it's possible to reach a place of forgiveness and not have empathy. In my experience with it, the deeper, how do I say this? The only place that you begin to move from empathy, from forgiveness into reconciliation, where it's finally completely over for you, where you finally open your heart to the other person. The only way that you can do that is to overcome the break in your empathy, both towards the other person and towards yourself. I don't know if this makes sense. Does this need more explanation, or is this clear?
No, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But this is, I think it's a key element in what we do. And I think a lot of what we do creates empathy without our even beginning to think of it. One of the routine ways that I begin mediation sessions commonly now is to just ask people to tell me a little bit about themselves. And I say, before we begin, can you just say something about yourself? And what happens is empathy begins to arise in the other person almost automatically, just because they're not talking about the dispute, but they are talking about themselves. And I find...
Go ahead, just finish your thought, yes. Oh, not sure if we lost Ken. Well, this leads me to the next question. Thank you, Ken. I'm sorry if you got cut off there for a minute. I can't hear you now, but the next question I actually leads right into this, and I wanted to ask Cine this question first. Cine, I was looking in your book on conflict management in the index, and you have several items on empathy in there. And one relates to what I want to ask: how do you show empathy to clients? And you will also mention, you mentioned the importance of empathizing with clients, and I wanted to ask you how you show that empathy to clients. And in another part of the book, you also mention the coach extending empathy to his or herself. So I wanted to ask you why that is important and how you do that self-empathy as well.
Oh, thank you, Lorraine. They're great questions. And I wanted to add to what Ken was saying, and Eileen, around my response earlier was because it was around forgiveness, is that I heard when Ken was talking about a technique that I think is important in what you've asked, which is what I call the concept of mutuality, and that's standing in the other person's shoes. So essentially what has been talked about, and techniques that help do that are much of what Eileen and Ken have talked about. So I'm not going to expand on that, but to tell you that the way that I help others is essentially a number of things. One is, of course, listening, which we already know about in our fields. What I find when I start with a client is to say to them, how do you know that you are being heard? What is the listener doing that you will know that I'm hearing you? And I want to give them permission to let me know if they don't think they are. And if you ask people, not everybody will say, I'd like you to summarize and paraphrase everything I'm saying, which is one of the common skills that many of us think let people know that they're being heard. However, sometimes it's just absolute golden silence that's going to help people know that that you're empathizing, that you're nodding and you're acknowledging, that you're saying in few words, sometimes paraphrases, that you are absolutely hearing people. I have a construct called the not-so-merry-go-round of conflict that I've developed, which helps people gain psychological distance from the situation. So it helps people walk through the various elements of conflict, such as their values and needs and aspects of their identity that they perceive are being undermined, what assumptions they're making, some of which Eileen has talked about around intent, what is the other person's intent, and then having the person look at what would they be telling me if they were here. And so having people being able to stand back and then walking them through the same set of elements. Once people have told you their narrative, once you know let them know that they have been heard, then when you take them through the construct, they start to gain more of a distance. And that has been known also neurobiologically to help people look at things a bit differently. So sometimes it's a matter of rehearsing. Sometimes it's, telling me what they're going to say. It could be reverse modeling. There are any number of techniques to help people understand, explain, think about where the other person's coming from. So when it comes to what to do with coaches in having empathy for themselves, I think it's a really important aspect of coaching, and that if we often talk in the coaching field that if you have a personal and professional foundation that's solid, then you're going to be a masterful coach. So if you're not solid, if your own conflict management skills are not solid, if you react to emotionally to what people are saying, if you personalize what's going on, if there are any aspects where people start to demonstrate that they're not present in the moment, non-judgmental, if they're using too many of their own assumptions, all of those things are reasons to look at who are you in this conflict yourself. And so I supervise coaches, so I spend time with people on getting in touch with their own conflict intelligence. Where are they at? What is it that is coming up for them? And sometimes it's asking powerful questions, whether it's of our clients or of the coaches, which is something to the effect of, what is the situation surfacing for you that you need to learn from? What's the lesson here? Those kinds of questions that have people look at things differently in a different mindset, also reframe it in the brain. And that's the type of thing that I think is so important for people to have enough empathy for themselves and to care about themselves and to believe in themselves before they're able to do the work effectively.
Yes, that makes so much sense, Cine, that we can't give to other people what we don't have inside ourselves. Well, thank you for that. Eileen, would you like to add your take on that question about how you show empathy to clients and yourself?
I don't have a lot to add to what Cine said. I thought that was really thorough. But I like that you're stressing that the inner work that I think a mediator or coach has to do, because that's always been my experience, that we have to bring a lot to the table in order to hold the place for other people, whether it's mediation, coaching, forgiveness work. We have to be really solid in that terrain ourselves. And so that I think she's absolutely right about that. I work more as a mediator, and in that context, I think it is a lot about really good listening, not necessarily reflecting back, but sometimes asking questions that are that demonstrate understanding. And so I think that's one of those areas where it is somewhat intuitive. But I like Cine's suggestion of asking the person. That's a very good suggestion. But just to make sure that I'm on firm ground. And I usually approach it that way, that I'm asking them because I want to make sure I've got it right. So I'm not doing it in a sort of solicitous way towards them. But I do find that powerful, and I also find that it's often after hearing me be empathetic that the other person seems to be able to rebuild some empathy. Ken spoke very eloquently about how that bond of empathy breaks in conflict. I think almost by definition, that's true, and that what we want to rebuild that if we can. And I think that's often how it happens, is through the modeling of the mediator. That they hear it maybe in my words, and all of a sudden they can hear it a little bit more easily, or that it doesn't sound so crazy and it makes sense to them. Or I'm not sure exactly the mechanism. Again, it might go back to the mirroring of neuron, that they don't have their guard up to me as they do to the other person, but somehow something shifts often after, as I'm being empathetic, then something can shift with the other person. Yeah.
That's such an important concept, Eileen, about modeling. Thank you. Because I find that true too in mediations, that people, if they see me listening respectfully and modeling empathy, they're more likely to do it. It's exactly the mirror neurons, I think. So thanks for that. Ken, would you like to add something about showing empathy, to how you show empathy to clients, or help people show it to themselves?
Before we do that, could I just quickly say, Ken, on my video here, your video is not showing up, so perhaps you could just turn off your video and we can see your photograph at least.
I couldn't quite understand that, Edwin. Was that
Ken would just turn? Yeah, this was to Ken. If he would just turn his video off, because I'm not seeing it here, then we would see his photograph here as he speaks at least.
Did you hear that, Ken?
No, I couldn't understand it very well. Can you say it again?
Oh, if you could just turn your video off. Oh, there we go. Oh, we're okay. Everything's okay. Oh, yeah. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Okay, I turned it off.
Okay.
And now I turned it back on again.
Yeah. Or we can leave it off. I was having trouble seeing you before, but if at least
let me try it again. Unfortunately, I'm calling you from the woods of North Idaho, and we don't get very good internet here, so things are a little bit compromised, and I can't hear all of the things that you're saying. There is one point that I'd like to add, if I'm coming through okay?
Yes, you're okay.
Okay. Basically, empathy is a kind of mediation between self and other. And because of the fact that there are two things involved, self and other, it's possible for the balance to get a little bit out of kilter in both directions, meaning it's possible for people to become so self-preoccupied that they can't understand what's happening with another person. And it's equally possible for us to become so deeply empathetic that we lose ourselves in the process. And so I think what we're looking for is a kind of maximization of our capacity to experience both as deeply and profoundly as we can. But at the same time, they're on a kind of teeter-totter, so that the more that you really deeply connect with another person, the greater the danger that you will lose a little sense of self-awareness or ability to understand what's happening inside of you, or better yet, the boundary that separates you. So it's important for people to not experience empathy as a boundary violation. And I think the way that that happens subtly is through sympathy rather than empathy. There is a kind of invisible boundary violation in sympathy. But what all of the research shows is that it is possible to completely lose your sense of your own body through a series of very, very simple tricks that are played on the mind. So, for example, if you put a video camera focused on someone's back, and you feed that information into their eyes through a kind of mirroring system, and then you create the image of someone patting them on the back, even if the back belongs to someone else, they will begin to believe that it's their back. The most exciting research on this shows that you can actually, in some cases, eliminate phantom limb syndrome, which is where a limb begins to itch or hurt, but the limb is missing. For example, in someone who was born without a leg or an arm, or had it lost as a result of war or some other catastrophe. What they do is they set up a mirror that makes it appear to the brain as though there are two arms or two legs, and they move the one that actually is still there, but the mirror shows that they're moving both. And within a few minutes, the brain clicks in and recognizes that that's the limb that it has lost, and the itching stops or the pain stops. And in a similar way, it's possible to use camera to make people believe that they are larger or smaller than they think that they actually are. So the point of this is, I think this also works with conflict. When we experience empathy in conflict, we are actually experiencing the other person's conflict inside of us. And this is useful for us if we're able to find a place that is not in the conflict, that is inside of us. In other words, a place that stands outside the empathy and observes it. And here's where another element comes in that contributes to empathy, and it's called theory of mind. And theory of mind is basically ability to predict other people's behavior based on the idea that it could be us, or to imagine what it might feel like, what another person might be thinking. And so to me, the important piece in this is not empathy, but the creation of a solid sense of self that is capable of experiencing a deeper level of empathy, because it doesn't get lost in the process. So I think this is something that we haven't addressed in mediation training, how exactly to do this, but I think it's important. And unfortunately, I didn't hear the specific question that I was asked, so I've just tossed this in. If there's something else that
you want
to remind me of, maybe I can hear.
That fit really well, Ken. Thank you. And we have about 7 minutes left. And what I wanted to do now is to ask each of you to maybe spend a minute or 90 seconds if you have an example that just lights up for you, that really stands out, of how empathy has helped a conflict or some miracle that happened for you in a coaching session or mediation that was the result of empathy. So, I didn't put this on the list of questions I sent you, so if you don't have one leaping to mind, that's fine. But how about you, Eileen? Do you have an example a specific example you would give of how empathy has been amazing or helpful in a conflict?
Yes, I mean, I think empathy is always amazing in a conflict. My experience, again, is that there's just it's really, probably the biggest magic we have is just giving that gift to somebody, that they're being heard and understood, and what flows from that. But just very recently, I was mediating with a couple who are really, they've come to me for divorce mediation, but it became apparent to me in the session that they're one of the few who are really not 100% sure. They're 95% sure. And so it's not something that I'm usually just talking to them about divorce. But in this case, I felt that it's able to, through empathy and sort of, as somebody said before, sort of seeing what wasn't being said, and then checking that out with them, to surface really a very large possibility for them to be able to work through something that might make a difference without having an agenda about it, and trying not to cross the lines, as Ken's really, I think, showing very well that it is something that we have to. It's a very fine dance that we do to sort of get in and understand, but not take sides or create agendas. And so that it remains to be seen, actually, what will happen with it. But I felt that it was through that exchange and giving empathy, and that it did open up something that seems could be very important to them, to their children, and even if they come back to the decision, yes, it's right for us to divorce, I think it'll be a pure decision, a cleaner one. So that's what.
That's a great example, Eileen. Thank you. How about you, Cine? Do you have an example you'd like to share where empathy was particularly important or poignant or amazing?
Well, when I did the research for the model, a coaching model, empathy is integral to this process. And so I'm happy to say that the magic of empathy happens in most of my clients, that unless people do start to think differently about themselves and the other person and stand in the other person's shoes, the model doesn't work, and the model happens to work 99% of the time. And so if I gave a specific example, I'm thrilled about that happens, but that came from the experience of people who are able to say, once I could stand in the other person's shoes, I got it. And so probably a most recent one, the model applies whether it's in families, workplace. I do most of my work in organizations, and I've been working with a CEO who does not see how her behavior affects other people, has no sense that what she thinks is a good intent is perceived and experienced in such a negative way. And so walking her through the merry-go-round that I referred to earlier, and being able to express what was going on for her and how she reacts and why she reacts the way she does, until she was able to stand back and look at how she was being received and heard. She had no idea. Very smart woman, and this happens in many of my clients, is that the fact is that people haven't looked back and stood and reflected and gained the self-awareness. And that was pretty dramatic for her, and I saw a huge shift in her behavior within a very short period of time. It was a very dramatic one for her, and it's had a big impact on her organization.
Oh, that's great, Cine. Thank you. How about you, Ken? Do you have a brief, specific example you'd like to share about where empathy was particularly amazing or effective?
Yeah, I love the other examples. Those are really wonderful. We could actually have another hour just sharing examples.
could.
Oh, we certainly could. Well, we're almost at the end of our time. I want to be respectful of you three very busy people. So I would like to just give each of you a minute to say anything that, reflecting on other questions or anything in general that you wanted to share about empathy to close this out. Ken, would you like to start?
Well, actually, I have a short story. Maybe this is my way of ending it. I did a mediation with a mother and teenage daughter. And they were having horrible conflicts, and the daughter was behaving as teenage daughters tend to do, and the mother was coming down very hard on her. And I finally stopped the conversation because it wasn't going anywhere, and I asked the mother to tell me about her teenage years. And she began describing exactly the same behavior that completely dumbfounded and amazed because she'd never heard this story before about what a kind of hellraiser her mother had been. And the whole conversation just completely shifted, and she became much more empathetic with her daughter, and the daughter became much more empathetic with her, and they really began to understand each other. So that's, I think, the most important thing that I want to leave people with who are trying to develop this ability is the idea that you really discover kind of the more you extend yourself. The idea that there are other selves inside of you, that there are other stories inside of you. And if you can access those other possible identities of people that you might have been or might still be, I think that you will then be able to listen to people in a fundamentally different way.
Thank you so much, Ken. Cine, how about you? Do you have a closing thought, or you don't have to? You've said a lot of wonderful things, but if you do.
I have many closing thoughts, and what I want to tell you, what I wanted to say that occurs to me is that I think that our clients privilege us by sharing so much of themselves, and they trust us so much to help them, and that if it goes back to what you asked earlier, if we do not have the empathy ourselves to be able to do that and to acknowledge that, then we aren't going to be able to instill empathy in them.
Yes. Thank you. Eileen, how about you? Any last words or thoughts?
What's occurring to me is that empathy is in part is a mental understanding, but I think at a deeper level, it's really something that happens in the heart. And that what we're really talking about in some way is opening our heart to other people and asking them implicitly to reopen theirs. And that is a huge thing to have for people to do when they've been through something that's been very painful. And yet they do, and it is quite a privilege to be part of that. Sydney's absolutely right. But that's what I'm left with, is that this is really an exercise of the heart fundamentally.
Yes. Oh, that was Eileen Marker. Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you, Cine Noble. Thank you, Ken Close. This is Lorraine Siegel, and I've been privileged to sit and listen to these amazing folks for this hour. Thanks to Edwin Ruch and the Center for Creating a Culture of Empathy. So have a wonderful, empathic, and self-loving day to all of you. And thanks so much for taking time from your busy schedules to be here. I want to listen to this as soon as it's recorded.
Thank you, Lorraine and Edwin.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. It was a wonderful panel, just amazing with the science as well as the hands-on experiential. So it's really fantastic.
Thank you. Right. Thank you for getting this organized too. The technology.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.